Anna Traiano, for the ones who don't know me, and I'm a professor of education and the current president director of the Center for Identities and Social Justice, which is hosting tonight's event. I'm delighted to introduce Ian Cushing, who's senior lecturer in critical applied linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University. As a former teacher in inner London, his work is driven by a concern for inequalities of race and class, and his research is focused on documenting and dismantling deficit thinking about language and education. Over the last few years, Ian has published several critical accounts of language and behavior policies in schools and classrooms around topics such as oracy, the word gap, tiered vocabulary and behavior codes. And his talk this evening, Ian will draw on his current projects, which involve collaboration on developing anti-deficit alternatives to dominant language ideologies, using speculative methodologies to imagine futures of linguistic justice.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks for that really kind introduction, and thanks for taking up time in your evening at the very end of the here to talk. I'll try and keep it light, right? As much as I can. Yeah, I was just looking at the title and I was thinking, you're probably going to think that in an hour or so you're going to leave with like a really fixed idea of what linguistically just schools look like. And I'll try as possible as to give you a sense of that. But I guess I just want to stress that that work is ongoing. Like it's not an overnight thing, right? Let me just... Well, if you got the mouse, sorry, I just need to try and click back and read. Thanks so much. Yeah, and somebody just asked about the et al there on the presentation, and that's really just to highlight that the work that I'm presenting today is not just about me as an individual that's done that work, right? Like, I get the privilege of coming to talk to you about it and discuss with you about it, but it's not just an individual piece of work that I really want to flag up and highlight. And it really is collaborative work that is part of a team and it's part of a collective effort when we're thinking about linguistic justice. In this case, for this project, so I think that's quite good practice anyway, right? But in this project, the et al refers to a group of amazing teachers whose work I'll try and demonstrate and try and highlight as part of the kind of linguistic justice effort works that they are doing. So the first part of the talk then we'll think a little bit about deficit thinking in schools and the kinds of like systems of deficit thinking and language ideologies that teachers are like up against, right? The kind of so-called system of deficit thinking. And then the second half of the talk is really about, well, if you've got teachers who find that system problematic, right, as many of them do, and if you've got teachers who want to try and challenge that system, or to try and find cracks in that system, then like how the hell do they actually go about doing that? Okay, so that's the kind of overall structure. So let me just try and get rid of this so you can see the headlines. So yeah, I'll start with a little bit of ethnographic field notes. A lot of my work takes place in schools doing kind of ethnographically inspired work, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the type of ideas about language that a lot of teachers are encountering in schools, and the types of ideas about language that a lot of teachers are trying to challenge and push back against. So a couple of years ago, I did some ethnographic fieldwork in Manchester, just down the road from where I live and work at the moment. And that was in Moss Side, so one of the most economically deprived parts of Manchester and indeed the UK more broadly. And as part of that work, I spent quite a long time chatting to this amazing kid, Benjamin, who was in his final year of secondary compulsory education. Black Caribbean kid, grew up in poverty, quite a kind of very, very classic type of student for that particular school. And he had this like this real kind of apathetic attitude towards education, or school specifically, not education. He expressed like very little interest or concerns about his upcoming exams that he had to take. You know, he wasn't particularly interested in school, like he wasn't particularly concerned about his exams, etc. And when I started to his teachers, like a lot of the things that his teachers said about him like really focused in and honed in on his language, and focused in on his language in terms of what he allegedly lacked, right? So the way that they described his language was all it was things like this, like it was unsuitable for school, like it was lacking in standard English, he had gaps in his vocabulary, that it was limited, etc. So like very kind of deficit framings of what he allegedly could do with his language. But when you actually chat to Benjamin, when you actually have these like one-on-one conversations with him, like you notice something actually quite different about his linguistic abilities. So outside of school, like Benjamin had this amazing linguistic dexterity, right? This amazing linguistic creativity. And that was like really central to his identity. Like language was a really core part of who he was. So in his own time, he'd been writing a TV script, for example, like he'd written a TV script about the intergenerational lives of Black families in Britain. He'd researched kind of shifting temporal styles of Black vernacular over time to like sonically represent like Black family life and Black language over generations. So he'd done all this meticulous research. He'd gone on YouTube and he was teaching himself like Jamaican Creole because he had this like deep sense of connection to his heritage that he wanted to get back to and to forge these linguistic connections with. So like put simply, he had these amazing linguistic skills, right? This is a kid who was without like truly linguistically creative, industrious, knowledgeable. He was an expert in what he could do with language, but that went unrecognised in school, right? The formal structures of school just didn't recognise or refuse to recognise what he could do with his language. And this might sound immediately like I'm being very critical of teachers, and I want to be really clear that I'm not being critical of teachers at all. Like, I'm certainly critical of a few individual teachers, right? But like I really want to get away from that idea that there are just a few kind of like rotten apple teachers out there. That's not the case, because of course what we know is that the system is the problem, right? So you can't see that text on the bottom. I tried to move it because I'm always packing my slides with text, but I'll just try and make sense of it for you. So this idea that schools are places, that are built on linguistic injustice, right? So linguistic injustice, and as a consequence of that, the kind of stigmatization of marginalized children is something that's a design feature of schools. It's not an accident, it's not a bug in the system, it's something that's hardwired into the very architecture of schools, despite what kids can do with their language. And that there are teachers out there who are trying to reimagine schooling and reimagine education for kids like Benjamin, so schools would be linguistically hospitable places rather than linguistically hostile spaces. Okay, so the vignette just gives you just a bit of a flavour of where we're going with things. So we'll frame all of this around what's called deficit thinking. It's probably a concept which many of you in the room are pretty familiar with. It's got a really long history in critical educational studies, but I'll just give you a little bit of the headlines about deficit thinking and what it represents. So at its very core then, deficit thinking is a victim blaming narrative, right? It's a narrative of deficiency which shifts responsibility And deficit thinking always assumes that the root cause of systemic and intersectional injustices is language itself, right? These alleged linguistic deficiencies of communities and individuals within those communities, rather than the external systems of oppression which shape their lives and confront them. So deficit thinking, like, often appears under quite kind of philanthropic, like quite benevolent guises, right? Like marginalized communities like Benjamin, for example, often get told that, well, it's in your own interests to change the way that you use language, right? Like it's on you to change your language, and that's somehow going to make you get on in life. Like, you know, that's the kind of root out of the social injustices that you experience. So a very problematic theory of change which pins responsibility on individuals and therefore deflects attention away from those broad systems of oppression. But it's always been met with resistance, right? You know, people just haven't absorbed deficit thinking uncritically, but people have always sought to push back. And Eve talks about how critical educational research and indeed critical sociolinguistic research shouldn't just focus its efforts on documenting damage-centered research, right? It shouldn't just focus its efforts on documenting injustices, but it should seek to reframe what marginalized communities can do with their language through desire-based narratives which highlight their strengths and their dexterity. And what it says at the bottom is that anti-deficit resistance is fundamental to linguistic justice efforts. Okay, so putting the deficit thinking and anti-deficit resistance into dialogue with linguistic injustice then. So we can say that deficit thinking is a really central thing to overcome in struggles and efforts for linguistic justice, right? Given that deficit thinking is such a central force in how linguistic injustice gets produced and circulated and maintained, especially in places like schools. So there's a couple of nice definitions of linguistic injustice. I like this one by Song because it highlights the structural nature of linguistic injustice. It's not just about kind of malicious individuals, right? You have like prejudices about other people. That certainly does happen, but we want to think about it in like more structural ways. As a result of that, things like linguistic variation and linguistic hierarchies get framed as a threat, as something to be flattened, as something to be eradicated, rather than something to be sustained in schools. And crucially, ideas about linguistic injustice are never just about language, right? They're always connected to other aspects of people's identity. So in the sense that if linguistically marginalized communities are devalued in society more broadly, then their language will always be devalued as well. So schools are like a real site of linguistic injustice. They're not the only space where it materializes, but they're certainly like a kind of hotbed of spaces where linguistic injustice materializes. It's kind of tempting to think of linguistic injustice as something that materializes through like very like explicit classroom corrections, you know, a kid being told off for using non-standard grammar, or a kid being told off for using the wrong type of language. That certainly happens. That's certainly a form of linguistic injustice. But instead, we want to think about linguistic injustice as something that's a bit more structural, that's a bit more systemic, that's hardwired, that's a kind of normalized feature of curricular assessment, pedagogy, policies, etc., which are built on dominant language ideologies. So me and people like April Baker-Bell, if you don't know April Baker-Bell's work, she's an amazing Black scholar in the US, wrote a cool book a couple of years ago called Linguistic Justice. Me and people like April Baker-Bell describe linguistic justice like this. So building critical knowledge about language, right, to challenge deficit thinking, but making those connections between linguistic stigmatization and broader patterns of discrimination. Okay, so making those connections between language and racial and class and disability, etc., injustices in a way that contributes for broader systems change and broader efforts for social justice, which focus not on the modification of individuals, but focus instead on the modification of systems. So England's schools then are like particular sites. They have a particular history of how linguistic injustice has materialized over time. Me and my cool, amazing colleague Julia Snell, have conceptualized this in terms of what we've called sonic surveillance. So the idea that schools are places where both children and teachers are under different forms of surveillance in terms of all of the work that they do, but especially in how they sound, right? How they speak, how they use language, the words that they use, the accents that they use, the prosody that they teach in, these ideas that certain pedagogies are aligned with certain ways of speaking. And then, of course, language gets monitored and surveilled, along with a whole bunch of other aspects of how people move, their clothes, their hair, their behaviour, etc. So language is just one form in which teachers and kids get monitored and corrected and surveilled in schools. As part of that idea, then, we say that teachers get positioned by policy to do things which they may or may not well believe in, right? They get positioned by policy to intervene and correct alleged deficiencies, but on behalf of the state. And what we mean by that is that teachers are often under intense, very complex amounts of pressure, obviously, to reproduce narratives about language that are contained within the various different policy mechanisms that they work with. That's important because it again speaks to this idea that we're not interested in a critique of individual teachers, but we're interested in a critique of how teachers get positioned by a certain system, especially in terms of language. And of course, like, these things have a really long history, right? They have a colonial history in terms of like hierarchies of language. Of course, like hierarchies of language and linguistic variation has itself a colonial history in terms of European colonial ideas about language. But in Britain, like very famous cases such as the schools for the educationally subnormal scandal, I'm guessing people in the room like know about this scandal in the 1960s, where Black community activists like Bernard Coard and the community activists that he was working with exposed how Black children in particular were being systematically perceived as linguistically inferior, place balance with education into so-called schools. There's a really long history of this, right? We're not necessarily talking about nothing new. That's important though, because as you'll see, the teachers that we work with and that we collaborated with, like, look to these histories of oppression, but also histories of resistance in locating their contemporary work, right? So the histories do absolutely matter. In recent years, and especially since around 2010, but not exclusively, right, England schools have seen a real return to a resurgence of deficit thinking. Some of us hoped that the shifting government last year might have signalled a slight change in direction, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So when we're thinking about deficit thinking and linguistic injustice, it's absolutely a bipartisan issue that crosses political lines. And as part of that resurgence of deficit thinking, there's been a cluster of policies and ideas and systems that have continually reframed and framed marginalised children as incapable of doing certain things with their language. So lots of you will recognise documents like this, like the teacher standards, right, where teachers are under certain layers of pressure to reproduce dominant ideologies about language, but the idea that kind of pedagogical quality is equated to speaking in so-called standard English, and that it's the teacher's job to like be a kind of standard language role model in what they do, and the idea that it's the teacher's job to kind of listen out for these alleged deficiencies that they might encounter in their classroom. And I mentioned the white ears of Ofsted earlier, right? The white ears of Ofsted are absolutely a central force in the production of deficit thinking, and we'll come back to Ofsted later. So again, like tying together, this is from an inspection report of a school in Manchester, I think. So again, we see those ideologies of linguistic deficiency that are being ideologically mapped to ideas of intellectual deficiency. Despite the two having no empirical connection, they've got a very strong ideological connection. Tom Bennett, the chap that is a kind of chief behaviour advisor for the government, reproduces deficit thinking about language in his popular textbooks for teachers. So here talking about kids from working class backgrounds being immersed in what he calls low language ability backgrounds, being babysat by televisions. Alex Quigley, I'll just show you the cover of his book just in case you don't remember it. So a very kind of book, very popular book for teachers about closing the so-called word gap. So this idea that certain children don't have the right kind of vocabulary for school and therefore they need remediating. Neil Mercer, kind of the chief proponent of oracy in schools, talking about working class children not having the right kind of linguistic experience and therefore teachers having a job to remediate what is allegedly lacking. We're starting to get the idea, I think. And an extract from a Manchester High School literacy policy, which says we have high expectations of students. They must use accurate standard English. We expect students to say it like a scholar, right? Whatever that is, like, I don't know. Who can tell me what is speaking like a scholar? I just have got no idea. Am I speaking like a scholar now? who knows? Okay. But the message is that teachers are met with kind of repeated ideas about linguistic hierarchies and as a result, linguistic deficit, which positions them as having to fix things. And those ideas translate into classrooms. So here's some notes and photos that I've taken on my travels recently, some of which you might recognise, because some of them made it into the press. The first one is like a laminated placemat that all kids had stuck like sellotapes onto their desks, so that when they were engaging in classroom discussion, there was this like permanent reminder of how they were meant to communicate, of how they were meant to engage with others. So a nice example of sonic surveillance there. Kids in South London, very famous example, met with a very hostile sign that certain word forms weren't allowed in the school. From a secondary school, a so-called word jail, right? So plastered on the wall. I know you laugh, right? But it's serious. But yeah, this happens. Yeah, so certain vocabulary items being literally banned and policed from the classroom. The last example is the graveyard of diseased vocabulary, where certain forms of words, certain basic words, were not granted legitimacy in the classroom. So like very clear examples, but like these are very individualistic examples of linguistic injustice, right? So it does happen, but instead we want to think about it as something a little bit more structural, and definitely as something that's related to struggles for social justice. Okay, so if we think about how those ideas about language relate to struggles for social justice, which is important when we think about, and I'll talk later about the kind of work that teachers were doing, is that a lot of ideas about language and deficit thinking often are in dialogue with what I would call flawed theories of social justice, right? Where the root cause of social justice is assumed to be the allegedly deficient language that kids are using, rather than the systems of oppression that they're navigating in their daily lives, okay? So deficit thinking about language often gets deployed under those terms, right, which relies on that theory of change, that theory of social justice, which says, well, the reason that you struggle in school is because you can't use language properly. Therefore, the reason that the route out to escape your social injustice is to change what you do with your language. So a very dominant theory of change, but I'd argue a very, very flawed one. So yeah, we see it again in textbooks like this, right? So I showed you a picture of that earlier. Classic example here of that theory of change. So Alex really says, oh, there's thousands of small solutions to the damaging inequalities in our society, and they can be found in the dictionary. They're words, right? Like, I really like dictionaries. Like, I really like words, okay? But I'm afraid that words are not the solution to social injustices. But that is the logic that's on display here. So Jonathan Rosa, an amazing linguistic anthropologist, says what this does, it just interprets systemic inequality as a linguistic problem that requires linguistic solutions, rather than what it actually is, which is a socio-political problem which requires socio-political solutions. Okay, so hopefully you get the sense of where we're heading with this, is that struggles for linguistic injustice are definitely not about the remediation of individual language practices, but struggles for linguistic justice are always about the transformation of unjust systems. So resisting deficit thinking under those logics then pushes us to think about relying on radical theories of change, which are transformative, rather than the transformation of marginalised individuals within those unjust systems. Okay, so I'll speed up a little bit. So as part of this work then, some of the work that teachers were doing that I'll get to in a moment, is that they were trying to undo deficit thinking, and they were trying to undo dominant language ideologies. So language ideologies are just those kind of deeply held beliefs about language that circulate in society. Okay, the idea that there is a proper way to speak, there is a correct grammar, there is a standard English, there is an academic language. Those things are not empirically observable categories, right? But they are ideologies. And often those ideologies produce linguistic hierarchies. They produce these imagined signs of pedagogical and intellectual deficiency. So some of the work that I've done with pre-service teachers, for example, has looked at how pre-service teachers get framed by their mentors and indeed their university tutors as like being pedagogically inferior because of this alleged inability to produce standard spoken English. Whereas for the white pre-service teachers in that study, when they used non-standard English and kind of local vernaculars, that wasn't heard as a sign of pedagogical inferiority, but it was heard as a sign of like coolness and relatability and indeed pedagogical quality. So there's always double standards at work when we think about language ideologies, especially what's called ratio-linguistic ideologies. So ratio-linguistic ideologies are something that people like Benjamin was experiencing, right? So when somebody's natural linguistic abilities get framed as deficient, even when they actually surpass or match the linguistic practices that are produced by more privileged, often white people, okay? So ratio-linguistic perspective then, we're starting to think about, well, how do you begin to resist these things, okay? How do you begin to push back? A ratio-linguistic perspective then is really like an analytical shift. Right, so it's a kind of way of thinking about language ideologies, and it's a way of thinking about how we might contest and challenge linguistic hierarchies that are often taken for granted things, that are often taken to be these kind of commonly held, deeply held beliefs. So at the core of a ratio-linguistic perspective then is this very crucial shift that we stop saying that the speaker or the producer of language is the problem, right, as is so the case in deficit thinking, and we say, no, the perceiver, right, the listener is the problem, okay, so it redirects our attention away from where the problem is. So, as part of this perspective then, categories like standard English and proper speech and etc. are not these objective descriptions, but they're ideological tools that are used to uphold and maintain social inequalities. So ratio-linguistic perspective then rejects theories of change like we've just talked about, rejects those theories of change that, oh, well, all marginalised people have to do to undo their own oppression is just to change the way that they speak. And it says, no, it's not about that. And instead it pushes for the abolition and indeed the redesign of entire systems. So that's the theory of social justice that a ratio-linguistic perspective takes. Okay, so moving towards the kind of second half of this, which is really, well, how do we imagine futures of linguistic justice in the face of all of the things that I've just talked about, right? So I hope it's become clear that schools, especially in England, are like spaces where dominant language ideologies persist, that they're stubborn, they're very durable, they're very pervasive, they're incredibly difficult to challenge. So how might people like me, like linguists and sociologists, etc., how might they contribute to actually real long-standing efforts to dismantle deficit thinking, okay, and kind of build new systems instead of what are inherently unjust ones? So the types of questions that we asked with teachers that we worked with then are this, right? Where are those cracks in the system? Okay, so a nice kind of metaphor for system change that comes from a cool scholar, very unknown scholar, Lillian Weber, who was doing nice work in early years settings in New York in the 70s. She was doing very similar work with teachers, right, where teachers were met with a very oppressive system, but teachers were trying to find these little spaces for resistance, because there always are those spaces for resistance, but sometimes they can be difficult to locate, and sometimes they can be difficult to widen. And the big question really is, well, in imagining futures of linguistic justice, well, what conditions need to be in place, right? What structural conditions in schools need to be in place for linguistic justice to be realised? So in something that I wrote with a teacher and a consultant, Dan, that I'll draw on a little bit now, we tried to answer some of these questions, okay? Or at least we tried to answer some of these provocations. These were the kind of guiding provocations for what we were doing when we were doing that kind of work. So we started off, this is a quote from the article that says, the type of thing that I've been saying about linguistic stigmatization. So it's definitely not about individual attitudes, right? It's not about kind of these malicious acts of like individual hatred or individual prejudice, right? But it's something that's more structural, and it's something that's underpinned by language ideologies which hierarchically organise language varieties, and that says the communities that are associated with them. Okay, so we engaged in collaborative work with teachers So we were following a bunch of work that's really kind of pushed applied linguists to not just describe language-based inequalities, but kind of actively intervene to undo them, to actively intervene to address them and to problematize them. And as is the case with a long history of educational research, of course, the most effective means of doing that are through collaborations with practitioners, through collaborations with people working in schools. So since around 2021, and this is a group that's still quite active, we've put together what we call a Critical Language Awareness Collective, or CLAW, we call it. And that's around a group of 50 teachers who meet quite regularly, mostly online, mostly after school, like in teachers' own time, right? So teachers like giving up their time to do this. Some of the time that we've had has been funded, which has enabled teachers to come out of school. But really, we've done it on a shoestring, the kind of work that we're talking about here. And we come together to meet and chat about critical issues around language and power and education, to share kind of pedagogical strategies and the development of local language policies. That's motivated by this collective desire to not just redocument harms, but to dismantle the injustices that teachers were seeing in their schools and wider society. So we developed strategies and tactics for kind of mobilising resistance. And as part of that work, what we did is we co-produced a manifesto for linguistic justice and like a set of pedagogical principles for linguistic justice, which were then used as like a baseline to which practitioners could kind of reflect back on when they were doing that kind of work. So as part of that work, what we did then as researchers, we did some in-depth case studies, ethnographically orientated work of what teachers were doing in their classrooms, and indeed the institutional shifts that were happening, and like co-design this kind of blueprint, right? This like framework for how we might design linguistically just schools. Okay. So that framework then, I'll talk you through aspects of that, have different components to it. Okay, so we said that the kind of conditions that need to be in place to enable linguistic justice are these types of things. So community and collaboration, that was really the kind of core of the work that we were doing. There was a strong sense of community, a strong sense of collaboration between teachers and linguists. I'll talk to you about some of the speculative methods that we engaged in. Ideas about building on the past, so critical language awareness, cross-movement, so it's really annoying having to change this all the time. So cross-movement solidarity, okay, so taking inspiration from different social justice efforts, thinking about local contexts, okay, so thinking about the type of work that was happening in individual schools, and finally pushing for abolitionist visions of schools rather than just tweaks of unjust systems. So at the very start of that kind of work then, we engaged in speculative methodologies, and speculative methodologies offered like a really kind of powerful way of doing some prefigurative work. So we found that speculative visions for linguistic justice, like when we got teachers together, we were able to ask them questions like, well, what does a linguistically just school look like? Right. So we did a number of different kind of activities where teachers were speculating about socially just futures, were speculating about linguistically just futures. And that enabled them to question the present, to think about current conditions, but also to imagine what isn't yet, right? To kind of think about and dream up different worlds, with the idea being that you can't bring into reality something that you can't imagine. So we were thinking really about how those teachers might move from those very early forms of speculation into ideas about implementation. So we produced this manifesto, this kind of shared vision for what linguistically just schools might look like, and I'll show you an extract of that in a moment. And yeah, these pedagogical principles, so a set of kind of teaching guidelines for what linguistic justice work might look like. So there's some of the teachers doing some speculative work. That was part of a teacher education group that we had together, where we brought teachers physically together in that space and spent the day doing some of that speculative work. I'll show you a little bit of an extract as part of that co-produced manifesto for linguistic justice that we came up with then. So some of the things that teachers were flagging up as part of that speculative work, I think, is really important because it gives you that sense of like the long-term vision, the kind of stance that they were taking about linguistic justice, right? The kind of starting point, highlighting the fact that it wasn't just about individual attitudes, but it was something that was a lot more structural. The sense that linguistic injustice materializes in schools in different ways, through assessments, through curricula, etc., is not just about verbal classroom corrections. It's about challenging deficit thinking. It's about, yes, like educating individual minds, but it's much more than that. It's about reimagining different structures. And again, taking that ratio linguistic perspective, saying, well, it's not about the way that people speak. It's all about the way that people listen and people perceive. So really come to the work that teachers are doing then, and pretty important part of this was this idea that teachers engage with linguistic justice efforts. So we did some interviews with teachers that were involved in the group, that like taking that activist stance, that taking that very overtly politicized stance of linguistic justice was like a really fundamental part and a really fundamental idea of the work that they were doing in efforts for linguistic justice. And that activist identity was often shaped by their own lived experience, linguistic justice, not all the time, but for a lot of people in the collective. So Lucy, for example, a Black Caribbean teacher, who had got this lived experience of what April Baker calls anti-Black linguistic racism. So she says, you know, I've definitely taken those memories of having my language judged into the classroom, and that is now then influencing the work that I do. That's those kind of memories, that lived experience of linguistic discrimination is motivated by this like personal desire as something that I've experienced in my own life. So Coombs and Penfield cite language activism like this kind of energetic action that's focused on language use in order to change existing language policies for the better, where language activists are individuals, in this case teachers, who actively defend their right to use their languages in different domains, often as a kind of response to state-imposed efforts to suppress or discourage the use of non-dominant language varieties. So as part of the collective then, we would share different academic work, including quotes like this, to try and kind of put what teachers were saying, like to give it a kind of name, right? Not because they needed that theoretical validation, but it certainly helped teachers to know that the work that they were doing was grounded in research, right? As part of like an evidence-based, if you will, effort for linguistic justice. I mentioned before then that building on the past was a really important part of the work. That was something that really became clear, that teachers really took kind of solace and inspiration in this fact that the work that they were doing was part of a really long history. It was part of this kind of long genealogy of language activism. So they were inspired by the work by people like Bernard Coard, who I mentioned earlier, Marina Foster over at the Institute of Education, Chris Searle, of course, who was located here in East London back in the 80s. So we looked at some of that historical work, we looked at some of that writing, we also paid visits to archives in London and in Manchester, like the George Padmore Archive, for example, at Finsbury Park, looking at materials where teachers were doing the kind of work that teachers wanted to be doing in their contemporary settings. So teachers found like power in that work, for example, materials from Black supplementary schools in the early 70s, where children have been given that opportunity to think critically about ideas about language and race in a way that teachers wanted to do in their current practice. So a lot of the materials that teachers developed stem directly from some of those earlier efforts. So here's a quote from Mawahib. I'll read it out rather than change that. A Black teacher, Mawahib, says that I took energy knowing that people had been doing that kind of work for a long time. And that reminded me that what we were doing was part of that, and that there's a kind of legacy that they were building. So that was really important. There's a couple of photos of some of the archives that we visited. So the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Relations Centre in Manchester, we spent a day there looking at some of the stuff around whole school anti-racist language policies. And the George Padmore Institute up on Stroud Green Road was a kind of real important space where teachers came together and looked at some of those older examples. As part of that work in building on the past then, I'll give you an example of how Tabitha, she was an amazing teacher in Bristol. And Tabitha did some really cool work because what she was doing was she was drawing on the past, she was taking inspiration from historical efforts, but she was also doing something a bit more place-based in the sense that she was really making sure that her linguistic justice work was very contextually sensitive to the particular school that she was working in. So she was working in this school in Bristol, which, and her classroom was amazing, looked directly out over Bristol Harbour. And of course, in 2020, Bristol Harbour was the site of Black Lives Matter mobilisations, where Edward Colston's statue had been pulled down and thrown into the harbour. So Tabitha felt that like she couldn't just ignore this, right? You know, like the politics of that and the anti-racism resistance and the anti-colonial efforts that she saw literally outside of her classroom door was something that she wanted to bring in to the classroom. But she wanted to do that in a way that related that to language. So she, with the help of other teachers in the collective, designed a new unit on language and injustice. So this was for like Key Stage 3 English students, so for 11 to 14-year-old kids, where the focus on the unit was exploring the links between literacy, language, anti-Blackness, and crucially, Bristol's role in the slave trade. So as part of that historical work, she looked at some really interesting anti-literacy laws from the 17 and 1800s that people like Arlette Willis writes about, where the teaching of Black enslaved people to read and write and to engage in literacy practices was criminalised. And Tabitha made really cool, interesting connections between that and contemporary forms of anti-Blackness and anti-Black language policing that she saw happening in Bristol schools herself. So she was making these really nice connections between this thing that was happening literally outside the classroom door, obviously these global patterns of enslavement, and some of the things that were happening in contemporary classrooms. So for her, those place-based efforts for linguistic justice really helped her to make those connections between local contexts and much larger global patterns. What's really crucial then as part of the work is that like we have teachers who are able to do very individual work, like all teachers as part of the collective were able to kind of make like pedagogical tweaks like in their classroom, maybe design a new unit, maybe do something on an individual level. That was quite easy for most teachers to do, not all of them. But by far the most powerful cases of anti-deficit and linguistic justice work then were those that enjoyed very strong and very active support from management, from head teachers, from departments, from parents, from governors, right? So there was structural support for the structural change that teachers were trying to do. So that allowed for greater teacher agency. I'm citing Anna's nice work on the post curricula here. So this like wholesale blanket rejection of standardized curricula and pedagogical scripts, where teachers were exercising their right to be autonomous and agented professionals in the pursuit of linguistic justice. So Claire was one of the kind of core teachers of the collective and one of the teachers that is really central to our existing collaborations. She was working in a really interesting state comprehensive school in the northeast of England, very linguistically diverse, very racially diverse, historically very working class community. And the thing that really marks out Claire's work is that it was absolutely supported in very active ways and very legitimised by management. So she was able to very radically transform curricula, change assessment criteria across the entire school. She led on whole school staff training for linguistic justice. She was able to do a number of things at a school level because of that very active support and legitimisation for the work that she was doing from management. Crucially then, I think I probably highlighted it before that, sorry, I missed out something on the earlier slide because it was right at the bottom, but just to flag up the unit that Claire developed in which she used some of these images by the amazing artist Wendy that we collaborated with when she was designing this unit on linguistic prejudice for 11 and 12-year-olds, where students were having the most amazing critical conversations about language and race and class and power in a way that was facilitated by Claire's expertise and her confidence in that knowledge about linguistic justice that she had already, but had been fostered and kind of built on as part of the community that she was involved with. So, importantly then, a lot of teachers saw their work as not just about language, that struggles for linguistic justice were always seeking to make connections between other aspects of linguistic injustice and things like racial justice, disability justice, union campaigning in schools, etc. So again, I'm citing from Claire here. Claire had an ongoing thing in her school around anti-racism and a commitment to anti-racism that the school were making. They had, sorry, that should say stigma. So they had this cool project around anti-poverty stigma that was going on in the school. So Claire saw like a really clear connection and a really clear, crucial connection between the work that she was doing on language and linguistic justice as connected to and indeed as part of that work as part of broader social justice struggles that were going on in the wider institutional boundaries of the school. So the most efficient kind of linguistic justice efforts then were those that happened at institutional level, right? I'm not like saying that the more individual efforts weren't valuable or important, of course they were, but the most powerful ones were happening at an institutional level. And teachers were doing really creative things to do this. They were locating those cracks in the system, locating those little spaces for opportunity in order to challenge language ideologies. So some teachers, for example, so Anthony's a teacher who's in the project, and we published together as part of the work that he was doing in the school. Anthony decided to use literary text, so kind of literary fiction, as like a way in to exploring language ideologies in schools. So Anthony built a whole unit around this. If you've not read this book, it's really cool. It's like a young adult fiction book by Kelly Yang, a Chinese writer. And has anyone read Front Desk? I saw it, wasn't it? Yeah, but central to Front Desk is this character Mia, and Mia's kind of like a recent immigrant to the US, and as part of her new school, some of the deep things that she experiences is anti-Asian racism, anti-immigrant racism, and crucially linguistic discrimination. So she has this amazing ability to use language and be a writer, just like Benjamin right at the start of the talk, but still she gets perceived as linguistically inferior by her peers and indeed by her teachers. So Anthony read this book with his class because it was just a kind of perfect like springboard for having critical conversations about language and power. Anti-Asian racism, especially important because it was just after COVID, right? There was especially a lot of anti-Asian racism in circulation. So Anthony used the literary text as this kind of way in, this entry point into tackling linguistic discrimination, including that by experience by some of the children in the study. That was all nice, right? That was all kind of really creative, really interesting and very valuable work, I think. But there's a little bit of a cautionary note here, I think, as we start to move towards the end. And this just reminds us is that we can educate people to have this critical disposition about linguistic variation and linguistic injustice. I'm not saying that's not important, of course it is. That should take place within teacher education programs, for example. But that by itself, of course, is never going to dismantle those broader systems of oppression, right? Critical language awareness in schools is great, and I'm all for it, but if that's the end point, then that becomes quite problematic. Because we know that efforts for linguistic justice are not simply concerned with just getting dominant language practices into the existing repertoires of marginalised children, because we know that marginalised communities, regardless of what they do with their language, would always face this ascribed deficiency and stigmatization and the devaluing of their language, whether their language appears to correspond to standardized forms, right? No matter if they're stigmatized in wider society, then their language will be stigmatized in schools. So linguistic justice efforts must focus their efforts on creating conditions where marginalised kids can bring their entire identities into school, right? That's the kind of easy part, really. But at the same time, pushing for the transformation and indeed the abolition of inherently unjust systems and the dismantling of language ideologies. Because that says at the bottom, there's no linguistic justice without social justice more broadly. Okay, so put simply, I'll just read the bit in the red here because I think this gives you the kind of key message, is that if we focus on language alone as part of linguistic justice efforts, that's always going to be insufficient because it doesn't address the root cause of marginalisation of linguistically minoritized communities, given that minoritized languages would always be devalued in school, as long as those speakers are devalued in society more broadly. I know you skipped this. We could maybe think about this in the questions, but what I presented to you is like a nice version of like things that happened that were okay, but there were certainly obstacles, like there were difficulties that we met along the way. So maybe we can come back to this in the discussion because I think it's important to just flag some of these things up. And just moving towards a conclusion then. Okay, just a couple of minutes. So we know that linguistic justice is not about individual prejudices, okay? And so if we focus our efforts for linguistic justice on just the education of individual minds, then it's always going to leave those bigger systems of injustice unaddressed and intact. It's certainly not a teacher's job to address those systems, okay? And I'm not suggesting for a second that it is. But what I will suggest is that unjust systems are by no means broken. They're just working as they are designed. And so no tweaks or reforms or ever. Sorry, I was clicking on here, but noticing that you didn't have the screen on here. My mistake, sorry. Yeah, the unjust systems are not broken, but they're working as they're designed, right? So no amount of reform or tweaking are ever going to fix those systems. So Arati Triprikash's book, Learning Whiteness, again, if you haven't read that, most amazing book about how systemic injustice is kind of hardwired into education systems. Arati concludes the book by saying, well, tinkering at the edges, making piecemeal interventions or locating blame or responsibility within individuals is never going to be sufficient. Okay? Instead, what we need is transformational change and abolitionist change. So abolitionist theories of change in applied linguistics then, or critical applied linguistics, are something that's long-term, that hasn't yet been realised, that's creative, that's hopeful, that's prefigurative, that's speculative, but crucially focuses its efforts on the dismantling of oppressive ideas about language in order to redesign schooling in its entirety. And I think that some of that abolitionist work is already taking place. So cool abolitionist organisations and activist organisations like Class 13 just released a really cool anti-deficit framework for schools. Organisations like No More Exclusions are engaging in abolitionist work and showing us that this kind of work is possible. So, final slide then is this, that deficit thinking is designed into schools. If we start to think of it as a design feature of schools, then we can start to think about how we might design it out. Through some of the collaborations and the ideas that we've done with teachers and that work that's ongoing, we want to push towards methodologies which are not just on changing individual minds, either to change what they do with their language or either to be more kind of receptive about linguistic variation, but on imagining and designing new life-affirming systems. At the core of those efforts then is collaborative work, which is grassroots in nature, which is activist in nature, and that draws on the principles of cross-movement solidarity and organisational change across different social justice efforts. That we need unconventional thinking about language, okay, that rejects dominant conventional ways of thinking about language, to reject dominant ideologies and dichotomies. That we need to do some slow linguistics, right? Some ethnographic work to really highlight the linguistic dexterity and creativity of marginalised communities, just like Benjamin, that I opened this talk with. And the final bit that you can't see there is again a quote from Arati, which says we need to build on the we need to build on the past to speculate about the future in order to critique the present. Okay, and this is the last one, and again, I just want to thank, that's the et al, which is part of this talk, right, and part of this work, is the teachers who I collaborate with, who are doing what they can to push back against an inherently difficult and unjust system. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.